no matter how you cut it on a day-to-day basis, it is ups and downs. You know, it is the very short periodic highs of thinking, my God, I've actually done something useful here. And then realizing 20 minutes later it wasn't quite what you thought it was.
Welcome to the Flying Fruit Bowl, a platform dedicated to the exploration of art and the creative process. This episode is the first part of a two-part conversation with the artist Mark Thompson. Mark is an oil painter who creates stunning landscapes and interiors that are both factual and fiction, and his work deals with the considerations of memory and truth. As well as painting, Mark is also a photographer using analog methods to explore the passing of time. I thoroughly enjoyed my talk with Mark Thompson, and I really hope you enjoy it too. The best place to start is where I start everybody, is tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became an artist.
My God, where to start with that? Well, yeah, born in Britain. I've been kind of led by the nose by my work for as long as I can remember, really. Finished college back in 97. Went to the Slade School of Fine Art in London. So after 4 years there, I was lucky enough to win a travel scholarship. Oh. And I was rather bitten by the bug at that point. And so I spent time in Iceland and Scandinavia and Alaska, and lived in Germany and Sweden, and now I'm here in Newfoundland. It's very much the pursuit of the work. I mean, I don't know what started me off as an artist. Maybe it's the biggest cliche in the world, but I don't think it's necessarily something you have a choice about. It becomes, I guess, like any vocational life. It takes on its own form as it will, you know. Was I the kid that was always drawing in the classroom? Probably not. But I do remember things from early on sort of pushing me in a particular direction.
Okay, that's cool. That's interesting. That's quite nice. And actually, that's quite interesting to hear that you weren't necessarily the person that was always drawing. It's something that happened as opposed to something that was more driven. That's very interesting, because a lot of people I talk to, it's like they knew from quite early on that they want to be an artist, or they were like, oh yeah, this is what I want to do. Whereas obviously it probably came after the fact.
I think in some ways it's very much a language thing. You know, it's maybe it boils down to the idea that, you know, you have certain ideas or certain things that you almost need to teach yourself, and you need a language to with which to say them. And I think the process of decoding that language, it's almost like the difference between self-expression and self-enlightenment. You know, I think that the necessity was for self-enlightenment, and painting is the language through which I get to do that.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So you said that you studied in London. So how did that help you and your artistic career, and what are your thoughts on art education? Like, is it important for an artist to study art?
I think in some ways I was very lucky to go through when I did. Certainly financially. You know, I was there from 93 to 97, and it was just on the cusp of student grants becoming student loans.
Yeah.
So I guess, like with all art students, I came out with, you know, the prerequisite amount of student loans. But you know, going to art school in London was something that I purposely tried not to do. You know, when I was a kid, I was very much a kind of homebody. I wanted a much safer route, and almost by accident. I mean, yes, of course, I chose to do it, but I didn't intend to get in. So suddenly I found myself in the big city, and the wonderful things about it are that I had the National Gallery down the road.
Of course, yeah.
And the second wonderful thing is, of course, you get to your degree show, and you're in London.
Yeah, but of course, the exposure.
It's almost like there's nothing else to say about that, because the opportunities are there that might not be otherwise. So it's incredibly informative, but at the same time, I've ended up as a landscape painter, and saying that landscape is very much a vehicle for painting rather than necessarily the end in itself. But it is a curiosity being a landscape painter in London.
That's actually a good point, actually, because when I think of artists in London, I do think of a lot of portrait painters, or a lot of different other media, not necessarily landscapes, and also probably because you don't really see necessarily, or maybe that's just me and the exposure to the arts I have, I don't really see a lot of London through art in the wider context of art necessarily. So that's quite an interesting consideration. So what is the biggest challenges of being an artist, would you say?
Making peace with yourself, I think it, in some ways, is the main struggle. Contemporary life, in some ways, does not equip you for living as an artist. I'll backtrack slightly to the art education thing. I mean, I went through the Slade at an interesting time. All the YBAs were in the thick of things and doing what they were doing, and the idea of being a painter at that point was everybody was still doing it, but rather feeling slightly sheepish about it.
Yeah.
And so my trajectory at the end of that was very different. I think ultimately it is a studio with like-minded people in an interesting place for 4 years. But it has to be said, for the first 3 years of those 4, I was an abstract painter. Trying to push it, I was making very large, self-referential, monochromatic abstract paintings that morphed really into landscape. And a little bit like learning to drive. I left the Slade thinking, I don't know how to drive this car. Now I've got to get in on my own and figure out how to do it. And so, I guess there's a kind of ennui that everybody goes through after finishing a degree. But I guess coming around a little bit, long-winded way.
That's fine.
I think that the possibilities in art education now are such that you have the atelier route, which is possibly better for actually amassing skills, because there is that feeling that you go through the university system and you sort of walk in the door on the first day and everybody says, express yourself, go on then. Now what? Almost like you've no business being there because you want to know everything before you start.
Yeah.
And there is something for me that's extremely annoying about the idea of de-skilling.
Yeah.
Which is something that's been relatively prevalent in art education. So I don't know. I do wonder sometimes whether a series of interesting workshops wouldn't be a better route.
That's true. I guess that's a good point, though, because I think, having gone to university myself, I really understand that you don't really get particularly the business skill you need to be an artist. Like, especially in terms of, it's all very well going, oh, create this work, create this work, create this work. You've got some time to create. It's like, but what are you going to do with the work you've created? Because that's all great, but it's the connections that need to be made is what's going to really propel your career when you leave. You know, because if there's one thing I've learned from doing interviews so far, is that connections are the most important thing within an art career. Like, the work itself didn't even technically have to be that good. If you know the right people, if you can show up in the right shows, or if you have the right reach, then, you know, your work could be propelled further.
Well, yeah, I think, you know, the business side of it is it can almost be like a dirty word.
Very much so.
You know, we're almost hoodwinked into this idea that as an artist, we must exist outside of business and finance and all the rest of it, to keep ourselves somehow pure, and yet then have the shock of our lives when suddenly we realize, hang on a minute, we've got to deal with galleries and collectors and all the rest of it. So yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think a kind of preparedness wouldn't go amiss.
Absolutely. So obviously this last year, and probably most of this year, knowing the way things are going, we've been hit with, you know, obviously the pandemic. So how has that affected you and your work currently?
It's in some ways it sounds terrible, but it's been extraordinary.
No, a lot of people have said that to me.
I think that maybe this is probably something else that other people have said to you, that as an artist, you know, we've been preparing for lockdown our entire lives. You know, being on our own in a studio is kind of normal. And in some ways, you know, going back to the question about what it's like being an artist, you have to square it with yourself. You have to square aloneness and isolation and time with your incredibly loud thoughts, all the while attempting to be authentic and be in the studio and make something. So, you know, lockdown life is very similar to that. I mean, I was very lucky in some ways. You know, I came away to Newfoundland on a residency in December of 2019 that was supposed to last 2 months. I was asked to stay an extra month to have an exhibition with another artist, and then the pandemic hit, and I stayed, and I've been here ever since. And I mean, work-wise, the work has changed because partly the residency and partly the time after allowed me time outside of everything else. There were no other pressures, no significant overheads, no time constraints, not working towards a show, not working. Do you see what I mean? And suddenly, I could turn and face the work, and do some things with it and accept certain things in it that I might have avoided in the past. You know, one of the major things that has happened for me is the reintroduction of an extended palette, which is something I'd have probably thrown my hands up in horror at the idea just a few years ago, and now I find myself hungry for it.
That's really good. And actually, I think you raise a really interesting point when you say aloneness, because actually no one said that to me, and actually that's a really good point in terms of the thing about being an artist is that it can be, you know, quite isolating and also quite liberating at the same time. And I think the fact that, you know, most times you are working alone, and you'll be in the studio by yourself, you know, it does give you that time to kind of contemplate with yourself and on your thoughts. And like, do you enjoy that?
Yeah, I do, but it is something that, again, I've had to square. You know, there was a period a few years ago where I struggled with it. You know, there was that sense of hang on a minute, aren't they normal people outside? Aren't they doing something productive with their lives? Are they all, I'm sure they're not all sitting somewhere wondering about what the next painting's going to be. But I think that on the one hand, there's no point wearing it as a kind of perverse badge of pride. Oh, I'm so strong. I can deal with all the alone time in the world. Or carrying it like a martyr, and it's almost like an endurance test. I think we all have to find ways to assimilate it into our lives. I've done it by being quite businesslike. I paint every day, and and again, I don't say that as a kind of badge of pride. It's just that's the system that makes it work, because it is, no matter how you cut it on a day-to-day basis, it is ups and downs. It is the very short periodic highs of thinking, my God, I've actually done something useful here, and then realizing 20 minutes later it wasn't quite what you thought it was. Yeah, you create systems through which aloneness and is both tolerable and necessary.
Yeah, that's really interesting though, because you're the first person to actually really address that, and I think that's actually very, very interesting. So I'm going to definitely ask the next person I interview, for sure. I think it's actually quite an important thing to raise.
Yeah, I think there was God, what was it? There's one of Joni Mitchell's famous songs has this line in it. I'm a lonely painter living in a box of paints. It's the cliche for a reason. You have to. All of us have to find a way through it.
Absolutely.
And I think in some ways that's what really changed for me with the pandemic and the residency, was that suddenly I had time to face that in a much more head-on, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger kind of way.
Yeah, because that's what a lot of people have said to me. Like every time I've asked that, I always ask this question every single time I interview somebody. I think it's obviously important to understand how the pandemic has affected the arts. I think for a lot of people, they've said it's been quite positive impact because they've got more eyes on their work, and they have the time to create. And I think the biggest challenge most people say to me they have is time. So so the idea of aloneness and kind of the kind of almost solitary confinement you put yourself within to create a piece of work is actually a really interesting consideration, because I've actually never thought about that, and actually there's a mental aspect to it, not just the physically doing the work, and that's quite interesting actually.
I think it also comes back to this idea of self-enlightenment rather than expression. There's the idea that art says something and that it's somehow communicating something. I've never been entirely convinced that it actually communicates anything apart from as a feedback loop to the self. So that the necessity of self reflection and teaching the self, painting becomes a byproduct.
That's interesting. That makes me think of a few questions. I've quite a few questions, but I've got them saved for later, so we'll save those ones for later. But yeah, that's a really interesting consideration, because perhaps rather than art be about something, maybe it's just we're basing it on our own personal opinions of what we feel it could be, as opposed to what it necessarily means, which is quite interesting, because I'm always of the assumption that art is made for a reason. But actually, now you said that, I'm thinking actually maybe it's not made for a reason. Maybe it's made, and then like personally for me, I always feel like, as somebody because I'm a photographer, so I shoot images, so in a way I'm a part of the arts in a way. You're also a photographer too, which we shall definitely get into as well later on, because that's a whole ramble I can get on with. So that's super interesting, as you're already probably aware. But as someone who creates work, I can understand that I don't care whether I think my work is good or not. I always feel like that's for other people to judge, because that's why I'm creating it. And I feel maybe the same is for meaning. Rather than me be like, oh, my work means this, it's for other people to decide what it means, and then I'll understand why I'm creating it, potentially.
I think the harsh reality for all of us is that you make a work, you release it into the world, and you're lucky if you're with the person that ends up with it for longer than 5 minutes.
Yeah, very so.
And likely as not, if the work sells through a gallery or ends up somewhere, you never meet that person. And so that person is necessarily forced to take that series of mental leaps and decisions on their own. So the relationship they build with it is independent of the artist. It's a little bit like a story of I think it was the artist Dan Flavin. This could be apocryphal, but it was told to me many years ago, and I've probably paraphrased it a bit. But Dan Flavin was supposed to have a big museum show, and the curator and the director of the museum were arguing about what colour to paint the plinths for the sculptures. And Dan Flavin came in and said, if you're worried about what colour the plinths are, the work is shit and it shouldn't be on anyway. Do you see what I mean? It's like we have zero control. Yeah. So once the work goes out into the world, what it does for us, it's not that it becomes irrelevant, but it's inevitably going to be doing something else for everyone else.
Yeah, it's almost like you lose a part of, maybe not you lose a part of yourself, but like you give a part of yourself that you give away. Maybe. Yeah. I don't know. That was pretty badly phrased.
But it's like it's the idea of agency, isn't it? Yeah. The work takes on its own life in a way, and will it end up in somebody's attic or on a junk heap, or will it end up in a museum? Zero control.
So I was going to ask you this question later, but I'll ask you now because we were talking about aloneness. But so do you feel like you're part of a larger art community?
Yes and no. I think if we dissect what you mean by community.
I mean, just do you feel like you're involved? Do you feel like you're part of the industry of art? And please don't tell me I said the word industry either. But
so sort of the art world in inverted commas.
Yeah, the art world. Yeah.
I think in a lot of ways that there isn't just one art world. Yeah. It's like a whole series of parallel universes. Okay. Am I part of the art world that is to do with fiscal commodities? Probably not. My work isn't in multiples. There isn't a great deal of it, and it's not all that flashy. So, in that respect, no. I kind of run at a tangent. My own little corner of the art world, yes. I'm lucky that I get to show with some really lovely galleries that I've had long-standing relationships with, and that's a pleasure. Honestly, I feel like artists we're more or less the same, more or less. It's almost like the thing that makes us a species means that we're 99.6% the same. Then that 0.4% makes us individual. And the thing that I feel part of in terms of a community is, you brought up Instagram and the sort of digital community. I'm finding that more and more, that the ability to share the process, both between artists and with, in a non-patronizing way, laymen.
The general public.
Yeah, people that don't make the stuff. It's fascinating, and it's a great connector. But I think what it comes down to is that you still end up closing the door, and when you sit down at the easel, you're still on your own. It's funny. Going back to the silence thing, and aloneness. One of the ways I do cope with it is by podcasts and audiobooks, and because it does in some ways connect you back to the wider community of art.
Yeah, that's actually very true. And actually, a lot of people I've spoken to particularly have said that, when they're painting, they listen to like art podcasts, or they'll listen to music, or they'll listen to something that denotes to what they're doing to inspire them, which I think is a great idea. I think it's an absolutely great idea. We just put this light on.
I think also, we are part of a very, very, very primal, long-standing tradition. We are, I'm doing more or less the same thing with the same materials that were demonstrated in the cave paintings at Lascaux. It's still moving pigment around in one form or another from one surface to another and hoping it looks like something. In a very real way, the the standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
You're part of art history the moment you pick anything up, and so the sense of community is there.
Yeah, that's a very good consideration, I must say. It's a very good consideration. And actually, when you kind of boil it down to what you do as an artist, it seems quite funny in a way. And it's just like, oh, okay, why? And I guess in a way you're like, why is this important, or why do I do this, or you kind of start to think about, like, where did this kind of desire come from? So I think it's always interesting.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's funny you say that. I think at one point or another we have to go through a kind of mental equation and come out with the answer. If it was good enough for Rembrandt, it's good enough for me.
That's true.
Because there are a zillion reasons not to do this.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, that's a very good point. Actually, there are a lot of reasons not to do it. You just have to find that one that that strikes you enough to make you do it.
And I think there was a great documentary came out, was it last year or the year before, called The Price of Everything, about the art world and the business of the art world. And I think it was the critic Jerry Saltz who said something like, you have to make an enemy of envy,
okay,
to be an artist. And I think that's very true. We're surrounded with images of everybody else's work all the time, and we hear their successes and we never hear their failures.
Yeah.
So there's a tendency to think that one is on one's own. Yeah. So another of the great things you have to square with yourself is we're all in the same boat. We're just paddling in different directions.
Yeah,
how's that for soundbite?
No, I like it. I don't know. There's something interesting about the way you talk about things. There's just something about the way you talk about things that are way more philosophical and more deeper than just, oh, this is a really nice, pretty image, and I really like that, and it's really interesting to me. It's really interesting.
Good. Well, I think in some ways, if you boil it down, what am I doing? I'm an oil painter, so I am moving oily mud around with a furry stick. That is what it comes down to. I mean, yes, that's a grotesque oversimplification and is in some ways almost self-insulting. But one thing I will say for it is that it contains almost like the secret of perpetual motion. It's you cannot help but have the smile of a man who knows his life's work will never be done.
Yeah. Oh, okay, that's cool. So let's get into your work then, because that's probably what we would like to discuss. I read your biography, which was absolutely interesting, as I do with everybody who I interview and who I don't interview. I love reading people's biographies. It reveals a lot about the artist. Assuming they wrote it themselves, it says a lot about the artist. And it's interesting. So in your biography, you say, and I have your biography pasted here, it says, my primary drive as an artist is to try to make sense of my place in the world. And that was really striking, because you're not the first person who said that to me when I've asked. And I'm just curious as to how do you find your place in the world through art, and why do you think art is an appropriate vehicle for that?
Well, I think for me, it really is the only vehicle. Art in general and painting in particular, for me, have always felt like the most human thing I can do. As a species, we've been how they describe us, an ape with the curse of self-reflection. And we cannot help but look for meaning, from looking up and seeing faces and dragons in clouds, and we have to, we're almost hardwired to try and make sense of things and to bring order out of chaos. And the world is a very big and confusing place. We generally haven't the faintest idea about our own thoughts, let alone the thoughts of everybody else. We're endlessly projecting into the future, or digging around in the muck of the past to try and find meaning. And painting is very present. It's a process that you cannot avoid when you're doing it. I mean, yeah, a lot of it can be a little bit trance-like in terms of, you know, you lose 6 hours and wonder where the hell they went. But yet it's impossible not to be self-reflective whilst at it. And I think in a lot of ways that's where the meaning lies. You know, a life unexamined, you know, is unlived. You know, going back to the initial statement, you know, it's the most human thing I can think of to do.
Okay, that's a very interesting response, because actually I think there's a lot. I'm thinking about there's a lot of truth in that, because obviously you have to apply yourself to the creation of art. It's not just whereas in something like photography, and I know you've got experience about it, so you're probably the best person to agree or disagree with this, but I think with photography it's obviously a lot more mechanical. You're looking through, you know, you use a machine to create the work, whereas in art you're physically doing it yourself. So actually art is quite a human thing. I think that's something that's quite easy to forget in the contemporary society we live in, where we're just bombarded by images that someone's taken the time and effort to create something.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you know, as a painter, it's an absolute anachronism. You know, and postmodernism certainly set about dismantling, you know, the whole idea of the angsty analog pursuit of art. But yeah, it's I mean, photography is interesting, you know, in relation to this conversation, because you're right, we are surrounded with imagery all the time. You know, every waking moment, most people are pretty much glued to a small screen, having images fed past them, most of which they're not really absorbing anyway. Yeah. But those images, as you say, have been created and filtered by somebody. And I think that has an effect. You know, I'm getting way off topic, I know, but you know, we experience the world visually. We can't help it. You know, it's part of the evolutionary pressure of being us. And I think in some ways that's why I find painting so interesting, because it's a responsibility. You know, the images that we disseminate into the world are like chasing time. They're the epitome of what we can do. And I think, again, therein lies the meaning of it. You know, it's not just random firing. You know, it's not just holding a camera up and photographing anything. It's choice. And again, with choice comes responsibility of what we choose.
That's a really good consideration. It's actually not something that I've fully considered, but you're right, because whether it's art or photography, or it's creating any kind of thing, anything that you put out into the world, you're right, there's so much filtering, there's so much process, and there's so much choice, and there's so much consideration before it finally even hits the screen, or before you finally upload it. And that's actually quite an interesting consideration. That's not something I've fully thought about. So yeah.
And I think it's also what links us back to the past. It's what links us back to the community, or, you know, being slightly broader, to the history of art, be it photographic or painting. You know, it's almost like we have a responsibility to the history, to not develop a kind of sloppy threshold. You know, where we refuse to think it through.
Yeah, that's really interesting to consider, because like do you consider like the history of art to be important for you when you're creating, you know, in this contemporary era?
Oh my God, yeah. I think you know, if we attempt to divorce ourselves from the history of art, what do we end up with? You know, the moment you create anything, it becomes history.
That's true.
You know, I mean, yeah, we like to think that we're racing headlong into the future with sort of flagrant disregard. But you know, I go back to what I said about being in London and having the National Gallery down the road. You know, these things become old friends that you visit and you revisit time and time again. One of the hardest things actually about the pandemic lockdown is I'm aching to see a brushstroke that isn't mine.
Yeah,
you know, to experience something other than my own visual self.
See, that's actually really funny because of all the places I really want to go to when lockdown's, somewhat over, it is London. I really want to go back because I'm not from London, but I haven't been this year. Obviously, I haven't been. I went like once last year. Normally, I go quite a few times, but I haven't been. And I really just want to go to some museums, go to some galleries, just look at art. Not like that's not on a screen. I think that's super important. So yeah, I agree with you completely. It'd be great to see artwork in the flesh. I think it's not. It should be seen as more important to view art physically than just online.
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things about the business side of it, going back slightly, is that it hasn't been so many years since the idea of buying something sight unseen from a JPEG. Used to be the absolute anathema of that kind of transaction, and now it's de rigueur. It's what people do.
Yeah.
A large majority of the work that I sell is sold from JPEGs, and we cannot forget the physical aspect. When we get onto photography, I think it's one of the reasons why the analog photography still interests me, because of the bringing forth the physical object into the world.
Yeah, that's cool. And there's been a huge rise in analog photography over the last couple of years, and I'll ask you about that. I'll ask you about that later as well, actually. Okay, so getting a bit more further into your work, what draws you to creating images of places rather than people, and what can we learn about the human condition by looking at landscapes?
I think it comes down to the notion of narrative. I think in some ways, landscape painting is a mirror, but it's a mirror. I don't want to keep saying self, but it's a mirror to the self. It's a mirror to the viewer. I purposely choose not to populate the places that I paint, because generally speaking, you put one person in a painting, it becomes a portrait of them, because we're predisposed to find the person. You put two in, and you have narrative.
Yes.
And then it's definitely about the human drama. And I'd rather draw the viewer in as that person, because I think one of the amazing things about standing in front of a painting or making a painting is that you stand where the artist stood, and you effectively become them at the point of finish. And I find landscape an invitation. It's an invitation to both me and the viewer. It's like a welcome, but I think, I think this is where it comes down to how things are made. Are my paintings concerned with a almost photographic representation of physical reality? No, they're not, because I think in some ways what they're trying to grapple with is the idea of a painted world. And this is where the difference between painting and photography widens. For me, the experience of looking at a painting and looking at a photograph are two very different things. And I think that's because you are invited into a painted world where things work a little differently. I think landscape has a great deal of, I would say this, I suppose, being a landscape painter, but I think it has a great deal of relevance the further into a technological future we get. Paraphrasing a really interesting book, called Team Human. Being human is a team sport. We're kind of in it together, and the things that we are predisposed to reacting to can't not be relevant. We can delve into the far reaches of technology, but we're still delving into them with our bodies, and the subtle mechanics of the brain, and we're still going to ache to look outside the window.
Yeah,
I sincerely hope so, anyway.
So that's super interesting, and actually the whole idea of realism in your work is definitely something I was going to ask you later, but I'll ask you now. So it's like, do you consider art, no, well, not do you consider, right, shouldn't art be a reflection of the real world, or do you consider that a painted image is a world itself?
I think it's both concurrently. Okay. I think that I think to come down on either side of the equation would be to put a big full stop at the beginning of modernism, and to say no, we'll sweep all that away and we'll turn that way instead. It comes back to the notion of how something is made. I can't help but quote this one. The artist Vincent Desiderio, do you know his work?
I don't, but I will.
He refers to narrative as being threefold, possibly the most important of which is this idea of the technical narrative, which is effectively how the object is made. It's the thing that the artist invites you in with. I make recognizable worlds, but they're not made up of blades of grass and the air as it smells. They're made up of paint and technique and time. All of this stuff is about time. How we navigate this kind of intricate dance of moving substance around to create illusion, and be that the abstract illusion of open space or the resemblance to real world objects. You don't stand in front of a painting and ignore the handwriting.
No,
because that's what we're left with.
Okay, that's interesting, and I think that's a very interesting stance. I think because the idea of it being concurrent is not something I thought about, and actually now you mention it, it makes sense because the interesting thing about art is that art is its own world. Like you look at an image, but it's like on a 2D, whether it's on a gallery wall or on a screen, it's two-dimensional. Yeah, it's also so 3D because it presents itself as something else, and it's kind of, as you said earlier, like the illusion, like the illusionary nature of just lines and shapes that become, that have meaning, become a place or become a person, become an image that you can relate to as well. I think that's curious. And so what is your opinion, actually? I'm kind of curious now. What's your opinion on hyperrealism and hyperreal work?
It's not an area that interests me. And in some ways that has nothing to do with the photographic reference. I like to, I don't know, I respond to, when I'm looking at work, I respond to the hand of the artist. And if the hand of the artist is ostensibly removed, I struggle to find a way in. It becomes about skill rather than technique. And it feels a bit dry to me.
I only ask because I've actually had this conversation with a couple of artists recently. Not in person, just actually through DMs on Instagram, of course. Because I don't know, there's something interesting about hyperrealism that it's interesting visually, and it's really like this is an amazing skill. However, a lot of people I've spoken to are very much like, well, it's really nice and it's pretty, but that's it. It's just it's like a boastful that, oh look, I can do this and it looks really great. Whereas it's not as necessarily as deep as, say, more of an abstract work or more of a work that has more of a deeper meaning or a deeper narrative. So I think I was just curious about your opinion.
Yeah, I can't remember who said this, but somebody referred to those sorts of skills as being, again, a driving reference, like learning to drive in order to drive around the block and show how well you drive, and then waving at your mum on the way past, rather than getting in the car and saying, well, now I can go somewhere. But again, it's kind of fashion and taste, it's not what you've got, it's what you do with it.
That's true, and I think that's a good point. I think that we live in a society where something like hyperreal art is in some ways highly valued because it's a skill and not everyone can do it. Yeah, I think that maybe because people don't see the process or the thought, or maybe just kind of the intricacies of just art in general, that because they see it and it looks, oh, this is amazing, it looks real, they're drawn to it.
Do you think it has something to do with this idea that that art is the one area in life, and I have to use the phrase again, where de-skilling has become almost a virtue.
Yeah.
Can you imagine going to the dentist, and him having said, well, I went through college, but I've decided to de-skill. Is that okay? No, you'd run screaming. Can you imagine going to a football match and there being no rules?
Yeah,
it would disappear into chaos, and yeah, it'd be kind of funny to watch, but it would it would still be chaos. And in a time when that has been championed in the arts, maybe the idea of the hyper is merely the other end of the spectrum. It's almost like either no skills or all skills.
That's I was just curious about your opinion, because it's something that I've had a few conversations with. Probably because I reposted somebody's work the other day and they're a hyper real painter, and I like their work, but I like seeing the process of it. I'm not, obviously the end result's great as well, but I like the process and how it becomes a series of colors, blocks of color, to an end product that's real or realistic. And then it opens up the discourse of realism and art, which is something that I always find interesting, and that kind of stuff. But and also because you're painting landscapes as well, and also interiors, which I want to get into as well at some point. Because you're painting like landscapes or places is the best way to say it, but because you paint places, it kind of opens up a. Actually, wait. The best way to ask you is that: do you think by creating images of places as opposed to people, it's more open-ended for the viewer to imagine themselves within the image?
I hate a one-word answer, but yes. Yeah, I do. But again, I'm only guessing.
But so, because with obviously portraiture, even if it's, you kind of have to kind of find the connection between yourself and the subject, whereas opposed to with a landscape, we see landscapes all the time, but then it also becomes a bit more. This is just me talking off the top of my head, so is why I'm like, so it becomes a bit more. You have to understand your place. I guess that's what we said as opposed to the viewer standing where the artist is. You kind of understand how you're relevant to the space itself, as opposed to the space becoming relevant to you. I guess, if that makes any sense.
It does. I think it's also a matter of how specific one is. My work tends to be relatively specific. It's not. It sits, or I like to think it does. It sits on the border between archetype and specificity. I'm not interested in making. Trying to think of a not pejorative way of putting this, but I can't think of one. I'm not interested in making wishy-washy landscapes that are just generically pleasant.
Yeah.
Because again, it becomes a difference between pretty and beautiful, or beautiful and sublime. What are we chasing? Am I decorating or am I painting?
So how do you choose what's going to make a good subject to a painting?
That's a really interesting one, because a lot of that is has to be felt response. You eyeball it, and there are certain places that I cannot help but react to. Exactly what it is I'm reacting to, I couldn't tell you. From a formal approach, there are certain things in the places that interest me that invite that give you a way in. So there will often be quite a strong perspectival entryway into the land, roads, rivers. It's like there's quite often it's one point perspective, because there's an automatic pull. It's almost like when you then view the place painted, you have 1 foot in the room and 1 foot in the painting.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Well, it's like I guess part of the art journey is firstly to come to terms with the skills that you can amass, turning them into some kind of feasible technique, and then making something with them that invites the viewer to become part of the experience.
Yeah, particularly the key word you said is experience, and I think that's a very valuable consideration. Is the idea of turning art from just a cursory glance at a really great image into an experience of experiencing that image? Because I think as an artist, surely you'd want viewers to engage with the work as opposed to just scroll past it, for instance.
Yeah, I think that's why I'm always a bit suspicious of work that is intentionally obtuse, or like purposely impenetrable. If I'm held entirely on the surface, then my eyes skid off it as if it's made of Teflon. It's like the hand of the artist gives hooks to the humanity in the viewer.
So I'm super curious then. So because your images are rather, they're quite desolate, and they're quite, in some ways, I guess, I don't know if it's better to use, but like bleak, I guess is probably a good word to use. So what draws you to that kind of that kind of environment, or that kind of thematic quality, as opposed to, say, creating images of, say, cityscapes or like busier areas?
Because I find metropolitan areas quite ugly.
That's fine.
The kind of straight line aspect of it. It's cities. I quite enjoy looking at cityscape paintings, but I'm not particularly interested in filling a world with cars and streetlights and all the things that you go home to try and get away from.
Yeah, that's true.
I want peace. It's like peace of mind, peace of vision in something, beauty that doesn't have to be fought to attain. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, the places that I have responded particularly to, I suppose could be considered desolate, but maybe only in terms of painting. If we see a photograph of Iceland, say, for the sake of argument, everybody goes, wow, what an amazing place, I wish we'd go there. If you see a painting of it, it's like, oh, hang on a minute, how can I live with that? Because we place certain demands on painting because of the history than we do on images that we're happy to throw away. Painting, it does something else, because unlike an image on a phone or a film or a piece of music or even a book, all of those other art forms, they cease to be the moment it ends. You once the film has stopped running, that world disappears. It plays again in your head, but it starts to be altered as you remember it. A piece of music becomes ephemeral the moment you stop listening to it. With painting, you're stuck with it. You have to turn around and walk away.
That's so a really interesting.
Well, it places different demands on us. I think maybe going back in the conversation but maybe slightly forward, it's why the business side of art is fascinating, but cannot be the driving force in terms of what to make. Because otherwise you kind of give in.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
To those pressures. Is desolate beautiful? Yeah. Is the reverse beautiful? Yeah. It works both ways.
It's just what you're obviously more drawn to and what you find important, I guess.
Yeah, very much so.
So, do you want your images to be fact or fiction, or do you consider them to be both?
They're factual representations of the experience of looking.
Okay.
But are they about every fact of what is seen? No. They're more about the fact of memory. They're about what we almost like what imprints on the back of your skull from something that means something to you. It's almost like, I remember seeing a really tiny painting by Corot in a museum once, and I saw it for 5 minutes, and I can still remember the painting. Oh, wow. But if I looked at it in a book, I probably wouldn't recognize the painting that I'd seen.
Okay.
Because my memory has changed it. And if I had to say where all the trees were in the picture, I couldn't say it. But I still remember the painting.
Okay.
In some ways, that's the kind of experience that the paintings are about.
Yeah, because that's ironic because my next question is actually about memory. So it's funny you should say memory because it says, so I put here, so painting and memory. So I put, why is art a good medium to use to explore memory and how does it add a narrative or reflective layer to your work?
At time again.
Yeah.
The physical act of making a painting takes time. And in some ways, time is built in. You know, it's in there in the process from brushstroke to brushstroke.
Yeah.
You know, say it takes, for the sake of argument, a month to make a painting. In that month, what have you been through? What have you experienced? The different emotional temperatures that you've contained. That's all changing. Memory is experience at a distance, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it's the consolation in some ways if it's good memory, or the torture if it isn't.
Okay.
But it's still at a distance and it still no longer exists. So painting in some ways is a good way to document a world that's already gone, or an experience that's already gone.
Okay, that's a really interesting answer. Yeah, because that's ironic because my next question is actually about memory. So it's funny you should say memory because it says, so I put here, so painting and memory. So I put, why is art a good medium to use to explore memory and how does it add a narrative or reflective layer to your work?
And I think it's why it differs from photography.
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course.
It's like, you know that I never remember who the hell said this. I want to say it's Edward Weston, but I'm probably wrong about this idea of, it was Henri Cartier-Bresson who talked about the decisive moment. Painting is the indecisive moment. It's still a moment that you're stuck with, but you come at it. It's almost like you have to circle back on it and arrive at something that you didn't know what it was going to be when you started, and yet it still arrives.
So how do you know when a painting is finished?
Because it gets to a point where the number of changes you need to make are smaller and smaller and smaller. And if you did anything else, it would become a completely different painting. It's almost like, this is going to sound a bit self-defeating, but finishing a painting is a little bit like admitting defeat. It's like, this is the best I could do, and I'm going to have to wait until next time to try and do it better. And in some ways it's arbitrary, you know, this feeling of, well, it's got to end sometime. You know, you've got to draw a line under it at some point. You could keep noodling at it forever, but in order to get better, in order to move on, in order to make something good, you have to release it. Yeah,
because the one thing that I've always thought of, and it's something that someone once said, I have no idea who said it, but they said that, and it's something that I've said, but I definitely didn't say it. But I've definitely said it in other interviews that I said it, or I thought that I have, that I created. For
we need to get our quotes in line.
I know I do really badly. There's actually a quote in a minute that I'm going to bring up that I actually do have a reference for, surprisingly. So yeah, so someone said that the whole reason that the whole point of art is that you don't create your best work intentionally. Like, you sabotage yourself, because if you created your best piece of work, you'd never have to create another piece of work again.
Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. I think that it relates back to the idea of imperfection. You know, as a human, you're prone to the vagaries of time and the body.
Yeah.
And your own taste as it changes from day to day. You know, something that we thought was perfect one day isn't perfect the following. And frankly, we'd be bored by it if it was.
Absolutely.
You know, there's no perfect surface.
No, of course not. I think, yeah, it's just like it's a progressive evolution of trying to find that perfection. Because once you find it, then you won't have to find it again. So yeah, I think
it's also it's akin to the idea of a relationship. You know, you create a relationship with a work of art, and if that work of art was by some miracle perfect, there'd be nothing to engage with, because we're not perfect.
Yeah, very true. Very true. So there's a really cool sculptor, and I feel like I keep bringing this quote to everybody recently, but there's a really cool sculptor called Brian Booth Craig. I know his name because I looked it up earlier. And he said, it was on a podcast called Artist Decoded, which I listened to, and he said that painting is not finished until there's a viewer to see it. Do you agree with that?
A painting's not finished until there's a viewer to see it?
Yes.
No, No, I'd almost go the other way. Whether, I mean, it gets a bit, if a tree falls in a forest and all that kind of thing, the painting is finished when the artist says it is, whether it's ever seen or not. But again, it's whether you're requiring the engagement for a terminus to this kind of circle of making. You know, if you think about it as, you know, you start at this one point and you come full circle to its end, you have to be present at the end.
Yeah.
You know, you're the beginning and the full stop, rather than anybody else being it.
That's a very different answer to a lot of people. So that's actually really interesting. That's very interesting. So let's talk about your photography as well. So your photography, did that start after your art or before your art?
No, I became interested in photography almost by default.
Okay.
You know, I had no idea what I was doing with the camera the first time I travelled, and subsequently ended up with a whole load of images when I got back, thinking this looked nothing like the experience, and being incredibly disappointed. The next time I travelled, I knew better. You know,
you learn quickly.
I tried to. Yeah, you learn very quickly to get what you want from it, and I think as time went on, the process of photography began to interest me. You know, it's like one of those really early daguerreotypes of a Paris street that has no people on it. I think it was actually Daguerre was asked, you know, my God, man, how did you make this image? Where are all the people? And it's because they didn't register. And that is so akin to painting. You know, those two things are so linked. So in some ways, I think the way I view photography in my own work now is twofold. One, the same as everybody else, it's an iPhone, taking things I see, providing a way to look at the work in a small scale, but it's also using the photographic process to see things that I can't. The last time I used it in that way was photographing pretty much in the dark.
Yeah, I read that and I was really interested.
Yeah, but it's like revealing a world that you can't physically see, but it's still there. And there's an extraordinary stillness in that. It's like watching something breathe, you know, rather than. Do you know the photographer Thomas Joshua Cooper at all?
No, I don't.
Do you know his work?
I don't know.
Just have a look at that. He uses an old land camera and goes out and takes a single image.
Okay.
Because he spent the time finding the place, judging it correctly, and making it decisive, rather than snapping a zillion, sticking them in Photoshop and saying, "Oh no."
Yeah.
You know, it's less arbitrary.
Yeah, I think that's the thing about photography, is that at the minute it's become very accessible, like, to everybody, and you know, in a way, everybody's a photographer. So how do you? Well, we'll get into that conversation later. But because like personally, no, I don't personally. But yeah, we'll talk about that later. That's definitely a question. It's a question on my list. Now's not the time. So how do you decide what will make a good image, particularly when it comes to photography? Because obviously, if you're shooting long exposures, for instance, you know, it's your dedication of time, and you want to have something worth it.
I think there's a great deal of compositional experience and hardwiring. You know, the things that you respond to in daylight. You still have a hint at them, you know, because of the way our eyes work. You know, I think, if I'm honest, I don't really know. It does come down to what matters. You know, when you strip out everything else that you don't want to take, what remains has to be right.
Yeah, because I'm always curious as to how artists settle upon their subject matter, because art's so wide, you know, so wide open. You could create images, whether that's photography or art or, you know, whatever, of anything. Yet you've chosen that one certain thing for that one particular image at that one moment in time. It's like, so how did you get to that point?
Well, it's deeply risky because by doing anything, you're not doing everything else.
Yes, if you're present at one place, you have to be absent at another, as I like to say. You know, I think that's
well,
it.
That's where the responsibility starts to come in as well. It's where, you know, by engaging with the craft of what you do and taking responsibility for your own self in relation to it, then the chances of making those decisions better.
So you said that you use analog photography. So what are your thoughts on the kind of current, I don't know if it's really current necessarily nowadays, but the current trendiness of analog photography in the last, say, 5 years or so, where the popularity has kind of risen a lot? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think, you know, any balancing of you know, the rush towards the flat perfection of digital. It was Iraqi talked about his photographs, and he always said that he'll never turn to digital because he doesn't trust it. You know, it's too perfect, and there's nowhere to go with it. I'm not sure whether that's actually correct, but there's something about the chemical reality of analog photography, which I think is very very hands-on, very human. But I think also, you know, some of the best photographs that we respond to they're wrapped up in our own memory pasts. You know, we're interested in Polaroids and light leaks and all the imperfections, the things that we've been trying to iron out of photography. And suddenly people think, hang on a minute, this is where my memories were. What I want to see is opening up a photograph album and saying, well, yes, my photographs from the 80s have gone pink, but that's where my memory lies. There was what was his name? A Russian photographer called is it Titarenko, who made, oh my God, they made the most beautiful photographs of people coming in and out of a tube station or something. And you don't see a single person, but what you see is this dark mass. Yeah. And it's like people fog drifting into the underground. And they're images that are like the epitome of what analog photography does. You know, it reminds us of time passing because that's the process. It's about time passing and the fixing of that.
So that's really interesting because it makes me think about, I don't know if he was the photographer who did the pictures of empty theatres, and it was like people, it was like a really long exposures. Yeah, like the really long exposure of theatres, and it was like the play was running and you just see the empty theatre, but people were still there. It's like that. It's like, it's interesting. It's like the way we, and it comes back to the human condition, like the way we amass to these, you know, public spaces. Yeah, at the end of the day, at some point they'll be empty. You know, that's actually like a really interesting, particularly when people are still there, that's super interesting because it's like you're there but you're not there, and then it's just like, you know, the immateriality of time. And you know, I think that's like super interesting, and particularly when it comes to photography and time, there's so much to be said about photography and time, because obviously photography is inherently time with time, and because photography and time, that's so interesting because obviously photography freezes time, but it also is a reflection of the time that has passed. So it's like it has this weird, it has like a really interesting relationship to time, and I think that's part of the joy of it.
Yeah, do you think it's like all of this, you know, everything that we're talking about is like an exercise in futility? Oh yeah. You know, we're attempting to understand our own time as it's passing, and attempting to leave something behind us to say that we were engaged in the struggle.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's about legacy, I guess, in a way. Yeah, I guess, because when I talk to, it's funny because when I talk to people about, say, the flying football, I'm like, oh, it's, and I talk to them about, I see it as an archive as opposed to the present. Like, I don't care about how many views I've got today. I care about what people are going to think about it in 5 years' time when they see it as an archive. And I always talk about legacy, even though I'm not going in anytime soon. It's like, it's this idea of like, this is what I was doing at this moment in time. It won't be necessarily what I'm doing this time next year, but it's what I'm doing now. And I think that's a good point, as you raised. It's about, the time we spend doing something and kind of showing that we were here for a certain, it's like a footprint for the future, I guess. And I think that's interesting. I think photography and time, that's something I can ramble on about forever. But yeah, I think photography and time are very interesting if you want to have consideration on time, because obviously even the act of long exposures, you're taking time to produce the image. Yeah,
yeah.
the final.
And
Yeah,
I remember.
Yeah, and the
I
final
remember
image.
the action doing it.
Yeah, but the final image itself is just one moment. Well, even though it's not one moment in time, but it's like a slice of time.
It's still one object, one image.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. And okay, so what are so how do you split your time between art and photography? Because they're both very different kind of mediums, and they kind of command a lot of time individually.
Well, for the last few years, it's been. It becomes a little bit like how many masters do you want to serve, or which dog are you feeding?
Yeah. Which rabbit are you chasing down the hole?
Yeah, everything sank away in favour of painting. I've been finding that painting fulfills all of those questions. Which isn't to say that I don't have a few things poking away at me that might need to be something else. I'd say at the moment, honestly, it's about 99% painting.
Okay, that's interesting though, because as somebody who does delve into different disciplines, it must be very interesting for you, because perhaps your photography informs your paintings, and your paintings perhaps inform your photography, because they're quite similar in terms of the subject matter and kind of the ideals behind it. So it's quite curious that you actually do choose to use two different mediums, as opposed to just being like, oh, I'm going to stick to painting, or oh, I'm going to stick to photography. But what
I think also, sorry, go on.
No, let's continue.
I started to find that the thing that I was chasing in both mediums could coalesce in one, and because what I am and was chasing with photography was access to time and memory again, and I realized that if I was a little bit braver with the painting, that I could bring a lot of what I was chasing in photography back into the painting or the painted world. Because I can't pretend. I'm not a plein air painter. I don't go out into cold environments and freeze my nuts off while I'm doing it. I'm a studio painter, because the time of making in the studios is what the process is more about for me. So of course I take it from photographs and drawings. So I guess in some ways photography now feeds back into the work in a far more direct way.
So have you ever painted nightscapes?
Nightscapes, no. The paintings are getting suspiciously dusky.
Yes.
Or dawn-like at the moment, which has been a really good pathway into colour.
Yes. Yeah, actually, let's talk about colour. So what kind of colour palettes do you because your work seems to be very monochromatic, or at least it has, less is more kind of appeal to it, I guess. So can you talk a bit about colour and colour palettes, and how you choose what kind of colours you want to work with, and what colours do you like working with?
Well, for many, many years, probably from college, for the next 25 years, I suppose, I limited my palette in a very stark way. I would make a dark out of indigo and raw umber and olive green. That would be the basic dark, which could then be altered. And then there'd be different greys and whites. And so colour was almost incidental. If anything came out of that, okay. Was I going to chase it? Not if I could help it. I guess at the time I wasn't wishing to press those particular buttons. And as time went on, I started to feel like I was chasing colour, but it was slipping out of my grasp. It was always kind of, I'd lose it somewhere in the painting process, and it'd be like, oh God, trying to get it all the time. And in the end, it was actually the interior paintings that started to change that, because the light in the spaces was different. And I started to filter some of the images that I was working from, and they ended up with digital artifacts that were colour. And I realised that they were much closer to what I was chasing. And from that point on, it's been a gentle slide or decline into colour. So now, gone from a very, very tiny palette to, in some ways, a much more traditional one of a warm and a cool of every colour, the reliance on much more traditional things like lead white and, bringing yellows into the palette, bringing stronger, higher chromatic colours into the palette, and making much more deliberate choices rather than just the incidental remnants.
So do you think a lot about the kind of colour temperatures and the viewer response to the colours you use in your work? Or is it purely more kind of how you feel about what you think will work?
I was very suspicious for a long time of what those colour relationships did.
Yeah.
Because it almost seemed, and I think I was mistaken in this, it almost seemed easy to poke people's emotional buttons with particular colours, and the obviousness of certain things receding or coming forwards in the picture plane. But I realised, and I would say this now because this is the way I'm going, that it's a little bit more complex than that. And it's certainly a lot more complex than I gave it credit for. So emotional complexity, or the reading of painting as emotional complexity, has greater possibility when you increase the possibilities in the palette.
Yes.
So, I'm not about to paint everything bright yellow or something, but what I am doing is, by raising the possibilities in the chroma, I'm finding that my own emotional buttons are being pushed in a more complex way. And that can only help the painting in the long run.
Yes, I guess in a way, like, your emotional response to the work you're creating is going to come out in the colour palette you choose.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. That's a very interesting consideration, particularly because you're painting something that may or may not be reflective of real life. Therefore, you don't have to necessarily use correct colours,
Exactly. I'm not painting green fields and blue skies and fluffy clouds, and frankly, there's nothing wrong with that.
Of course not.
But that isn't the area that I'm attempting to delve around in.
I think that's why I find your work very fascinating, because it's real and not real. It's sad, but also quite hopeful. I think it exists in this kind of in-between plane where it's not quite one thing, but then it's not quite another. And then you talk about time and memory, and then that's adds some of the significant weight to it. And I think it's fascinating. And I feel like I say this to everybody, but it's fascinating, and it draws you in on a different level, just to be like, oh, this is a nicely painted landscape. It's like, okay, so what actually are you looking at, and what is it actually meant to represent?
What is expected of me as I'm looking at it?
Yeah, see, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And that's nice that you're engaged with the knowledge that that's what your work can do.
Well, I think it does it for me, because in some ways, what I'm attempting to do is create objects. Objects is the wrong word. Spaces that are just as internal as they are external. It's a world as I would rather see it than a depiction of the world as it necessarily is.
Yeah, art is one of the best forms of escapism. So absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, let's face it. It has to be amusing, otherwise we wouldn't do it all the time.
Absolutely true. And actually, that is actually really nice into the next question, which
you're welcome.
No, perfectly. It happens a lot, so it's perfect. Yeah. So how do you, as an artist, make sure that you're not repeating the same ideas and the same concepts, and that you're evolving? And how important is it for you to evolve as an artist?
rigor. You have to be rigorous with yourself. But having said that, the almost certainly modern and exponentially contemporary view of progress as being this very quick onwards movement doesn't really work when you're making paintings that might take a month to do. Some of the most interesting lives in painting that one sees, very little movement has actually been made, but the movement is subtle. The paintings of Giorgio Morandi, for example, he painted bottles and collections of things in his studio, and yet they changed. The raw materials, let's face it, my raw materials are pretty slim. I'm still making oil paintings on flat surfaces that are more or less rectangular.
Yeah.
I've introduced some serious restrictions there. I'm more interested in, okay, let's actually flip that. I'm not interested in my work as a series of projects.
Okay.
I'm interested in it as a body of work, a life body of work that is ever evolving at varying rate.
Okay. That's a very interesting way to look at it, as opposed to being, actually, that's a very interesting way to look at it. And it seems like it allows you to, rather than be like, okay, so what's my next project? It's just to work on a piece and be like, I'll figure out where this fits in at a later date. It doesn't really matter right now. But then that obviously what you're doing is going to be referential to something that you've done before at some other point in a different way.
Yeah, it's like a project appears to have a beginning and an end, whereas a lifetime spent painting is continuous, and it has the room for something to be thoroughly explored, rather than okay, let's zip through this as quick as we can, answer a particular question, and then jump onto another one.
Nice. Like this. So that's actually a really interesting consideration, and actually it might be worthwhile for people just to think of their work as an overall collective, as rather than projects, because you're right, because then I feel like that's a good point, because then you're right, because if you put an end to a project, then it almost like you're closing a door you don't want to reopen again, when actually you might not be finished with the ideas and the thoughts and the themes that you were exploring.
No, exactly. One of the most useful things that was ever said to me when I started my career, for want of a better word, it was the final day of my degree, and I think the degree show was up, and we just received our final marks, and the professor, who I hadn't really spoken to much in my time at the Slade, sat down next to me. I was sitting on a bench outside, and he sat down next to me and he said, "Mark, your career is 80 years. It's not 6 months." And that has always stuck with me. And it was the most useful thing anybody has ever said to me in regard to art. Because it's not a lifestyle. It's not an affectation that you use to make your life more flamboyant, or provide yourself with a diversion. It's much more intrinsic than that. Once, it sounds a bit over dramatic, but once it's chosen you, there's no shaking it loose.
No, that's true, because even whether you formally learn like art or not, I think you're right. I think at the end of the day, if you're a creative, you'll find a way to be a creative. It doesn't matter what the respect is and what that final project will be. You'll be a creative in some outlet.
Painting calls you back to the easel. And it keeps calling you.
Yeah, it's just the same way, like for me in photography, is that like I might not necessarily shoot something for like a year, but there's no way that I would ever just give it up, because I just really couldn't. I still have ideas. I still have interesting places I want to go and things I want to shoot, and ideas that I really feel the need, I feel compelled to take. So I agree with that. I feel like you don't force creativity, because you harness it.
I think also creativity only gets you so far. you know, it's a little bit like, it's why I think drawing is so important.
Yeah.
As the backbone to everything that we do, because it gives you a framework in which to be creative. You know, without a series of skills that allow you to communicate your visual language with yourself, how can you hope to share it with anybody else?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good
otherwise point. Otherwise it's a bit like otherwise it becomes a bit stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
You know.
So actually, there's a question I was going to ask you later, but I'll ask you now, which I feel like I've said way too much. But so would you create your work if nobody ever saw it?
Of course, you know, I mean, it's very easy to say that, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, you never know whether something's going to be a success. You never know whether that success is going to turn into a sale, whether you can ever afford to make any more of them, and yet you keep doing it.
Yeah.
You know, in some ways you have to be practical about it and businesslike and say, well, the audience is a love, you know, it is like your act of love. You know, you're hoping to give something of yourself and hope that it's understood. But whether it's understood or not, you still keep giving it.
Yeah. So talking about that, actually, so do you have a specific viewer in mind for your images when you create work?
Viewer? No, I'm not sure I can, because of the randomness of where they might go, and if they go anywhere at all. I guess, you know, my ultimate viewer is me, because I don't know what they're going to become, and in the nicest possible sense, you know, I'm making them to amuse myself.
No, I agree. I couldn't understand that.
I think, you know, it's tempting to be over romantic about it and say, oh, you know, I only make work for myself. And of course, everybody, you know, it's impossible to say they're only for me, because there is a viewer, and I'm lucky that there is one. You know, people fortunately respond to the work to varying degrees, and that's a great luxury and a privilege, because I actually get to consider a viewer. Who that viewer is, I have no control over.
Well, I mean, do you think there's a certain type of viewer that is drawn to your work?
I feel like I'm about to alienate half of my my viewing public. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. You know, the paintings are, you know, they do have a reflective melancholy in them. You know, there's no point pretending otherwise. Yeah. And some people are going to be won't wish to engage with that, and that's fair enough. So I imagine that my viewer is going to be some kind of kindred spirit.
At least you have kind of a grip and a hands on the kind of potential viewers of your work, so that, you know, you're not just like throwing it wide open that, oh, I don't care who views it, anyone can view it. You kind of have an inkling of what you're drawn to and what other people are drawn to within your work.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny because I almost don't know where to go with that. I think that anything that demands time of the viewer in any way is going to require emotional breadth.
Yes, of course.
Whether the viewer wants to give it or not.
Yes, like art is an emotional investment.
Yeah, it sort of has to be. Yeah. And if it isn't, then I suspect the experience is cold and dry and arid. You know, I think there's a reason why people, you know, come out of museums tired. You know, it's not, we don't walk all that far in museums. It's nice and warm. You know, it's quite pleasant. We can sit down whenever we like, more or less. And yet we still come out tired. Why is that? It's because we're giving of ourselves emotionally to the history of art. People cry in front of art.
Yeah.
Why is that?
It's because they have a connection to it. Yeah, I mean that's true. It's kind of
demanding something.
Like that's the kind of fascinating thing about art, though, is that it can be so emotive and so provocative, and so you know, it gives something whilst you're viewing it. Also, it's like it's like it's a two-way street, I guess, in a way. That's probably the worst way to put it, but it's like,
I think you enter into a feedback loop.
Yes, thank you. That's it.
Feedback. I'm not prone to being massively emotionally affected by art, despite the fact that I make the stuff. But the one of the times it's actually happened was in front of a series of 3 Caravaggio paintings in Rome. Oh. And I wasn't expecting the experience at all, but it was like being introduced to the potential for what it could be, and being overwhelmed by how little I had so far achieved, but what was possible.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing about art for me personally, is that art makes me curious. It makes me curious about what it is that I'm looking at, and also the person who created it. Hence, interviewing people and stuff. Like it's that curiosity, and I think art is a perfect segue into somebody else's life without having to necessarily know them.
Yeah,
it's like it's like a symbol. Like your work is a symbol of yourself. So yeah, I think that's interesting. That's a question I want to ask you later that I'm going to say for later. But so this is another question I was going to ask you later, but I'll ask you now. It's like, why do you think art is important?
Why is art important? Because I think it predates language. I think it predates verbal and certainly written language. It's a way of decoding the world with a kind of visual immediacy that it's almost like it speaks to our biology. It's part of our past. It's like a thread that runs through our human history. It's only really in the last few hundred years that, and certainly in the last 100 years, that the artist has been seen as something to be amused by. The kind of enfant terrible of humanity. Art was a business wrong word, profession, like being an architect or a doctor or a lawyer, up until the modern era. And whatever we think of it now, we raise institutions to the praise of it.
Yeah.
For a very good reason. I think it's also because these people were not sloppy thinkers. They were they made the best of what we can do. These are the things that we've chosen to leave behind us, and others celebrate them. So I think it's indelibly important.
I mean, of course, like obviously, I imagine you would, because you're part of creating art. So I imagine you would, because
yeah, I suppose I would, wouldn't I?
Well, one would hope, but then again, not necessarily. You could be doing it for the money. I mean, people do that. So, yeah. I think. Okay, this is the second part of that question that I was going to ask you later. I've asked you that one now, so I have to ask you this one now. So, what do you think the role of the artist is in this contemporary society?
But in that question, do you mean the role that contemporary society bestows upon the artist, or what do you think, or what the role of the artist ought to be?
Both.
I don't think it's really changed. Not really. I think it might be. I think art, or the artist, reminds us of what it means to be human. I dislike how the artist is often seen and portrayed in contemporary society. The phenomena of art speak, and the kind of intentional obfuscation of meaning that we've done to ourselves has ostracized and confused everybody else, and it's almost like we as artists have placed ourselves, or the business of art, the mystification of art, has made it impenetrable. And whereas actually we're addressing the simplest and biggest questions of being alive. I think that's the role. We're not journalists, we're not documentarians. We're doing something else. We're leaving behind a trail of images and objects that, if not seek to understand, then certainly engage with the struggle of being human. Yeah, I think that's the best I can do on that one. Really.
That's fine. That's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. So let's get back into your work a little bit, because I kind of went off topic. So interiors. So your interiors are really fascinating. They have a very dreamlike quality to them, which I don't know if that was necessarily intended. But when I was looking at them, they seem very dreamlike and very kind of, I don't want to say mystical, but I don't know. There's something about them that really struck me. Not as opposed to your landscapes, because your landscapes are just as equally interesting, but there's something about this idea of a physical space that you're capturing that is just has a different vibe, I guess, to your landscapes, because obviously landscapes are exterior, whereas in your interiors are obviously interior. How is the approach different in your creation of interiors as opposed to exteriors?
Well, I think from a practical point of view, the drawing is obviously much more of a challenge. So you cannot help but be much more rigorous about the preliminary process. But at the same time, the bravery requirements of straying from underpainting, for example, locking something in and then allowing it to dissolve before locking it back in again. But I think emotionally they are very different spaces. I think one of the reasons why I veered away a little from them is because they began to feel like repositories. It was almost like this is something that contains the viewer, contains me. Yeah. Rather than being an invitation into the world, they're almost like a kind of purgatory where you find your way through. And I guess in some ways that's where the dreamlike quality comes in, because it ends up being you confronting a space.
I guess in a way it becomes a box around the viewer.
Yeah, it's in some ways it's a little bit like the difference between Renaissance and Mannerist attitudes to the picture plane. Yeah. The interiors are very much like stage sets. The perspective is clear, it draws you into a space in which your own drama plays out. The landscapes in some ways are much more about intruding into our world.
Yeah, because I think with the interiors, they're like, and as you said, they're an enclosed space. Therefore, it's a lot more restrictive. Like the viewing of it is more restrictive as opposed to with landscapes, because they're, like interiors are very specific. Yeah. Whereas in landscapes are obviously a lot more open. Like landscapes, you can have a similar landscape in different places. But
yeah, also the rules are different. The rules are different for making and viewing. I made the one that's. There are two paintings that automatically leap to mind when I think about the interiors. One is called Witness, and the other one is called Of Hidden Doorways. And they're both pretty dark pictures that have a kind of dustiness to them. They're if not abandoned, then certainly unpopulated. So they end up becoming even more of a mirror. You're projecting yourself into a space that has limits. And what concerned me about them was they ended up being a little bit like film sets, and those films I didn't necessarily want to reference.
Okay.
My gallerist in Germany, he refers to them as Caspar David Friedrich meets Resident Evil. And he wasn't too far off, and I'm not sure I really wanted to push those buttons.
I think that's really interesting though, that your engaged enough with your work to understand that, as opposed to being like, oh yeah, I like that, or oh, I don't like that, or oh, I'm going to create that again, or I'm not going to create that again. Like, that's interesting that you still have them on your site and you still view them and you still consider them as part of your work, even if they're not as necessarily as, I guess, quote unquote, successful as your landscapes necessarily. I think that's really interesting.
Well, I think it's because it's not a closed circuit. They, in some ways, all paintings are a stepping stone in a greater pond that you're crossing. I don't know. They're punctuation marks.
Yeah.
In a broader story, and you have to leave them behind as they are. They're a representation of where you were at that point. And I guess I've also come to realize how affected we are by environmental pressures. For example, coming to Newfoundland had a massive impact on what I chose to paint. And it's like a trickle down process. It leaches out of you somehow. And suddenly you end up thinking, hang on a minute, I didn't intend to exactly do that. But yet here it is, because it's filtered through you. Yeah, I mean, it's eternal mystery, I suppose. We're a mystery to ourselves.
Absolutely. That's part of the process. That's part of the joy and the pleasure of being able to create something. I feel like with every image you create, you're that one step closer to the unreachable.
Yeah.
I think that's really kind of the joy of it. And I think, I think that's a great answer. It's a very great answer.
Thank you.
So moving on slightly, but not too much. So exhibiting work is definitely something I want to talk to you about, because you're actually quite well represented in terms of your work. If you start from the beginning, in terms of at what point did you know that your work was quote unquote good enough to start exhibiting? And also, what was the process been like exhibiting your work?
I think false modesty is pointless. There's no point saying, oh, I don't know whether it's any good. At a certain point, they got to a point where they felt like they responded to me as I wished, or they started hinting at me that they might be good enough to be inflicted upon the world. And but I think also, it's taken out of your hands slightly. The moment you take the decision, right, I'm going to go to art school because I want to get better at this, and at the end of art school there is an exhibition.
Of course.
You're pulled really by the magnet of it. When you first see them exhibited together in a space, that changes things, because they're not what you thought they were, or they are, but even more so. And you can't know it until you see them.
Yeah.
For some of my career, I've really enjoyed the process of showing, being there and just being around the work and having other people be around the work. But also other times, maybe at times of much more financial pressure, they're fraught experiences, because you can't help but say, geez, please, somebody have one. That's part of the process, because you want to make more. Honestly, I think it's more important to make the work than to live for the action of showing, because that moment is going to be over in a couple of hours.
Yeah.
And it'll exist as a line on your CV and maybe some images. It is a great way to reflect on where the work is, and how it relates, how each painting relates to another one, how they relate to a blank space. In some ways, what you're doing is you're putting them into an idealized environment and hoping that they stand up on their own.
Yeah.
And that they've got legs. Occasionally they don't.
Yeah, that's true.
The work can suddenly feel much smaller or much bigger or far bleaker or more hopeful or warmer, or and you can't really know that until you get a grasp of them together. But like I said at the beginning, I've had a great deal of luck in finding a few galleries or dealers that I've been able to foster a good relationship with, and that's a challenge.
Sure. I think also part of it is the fact that you also have to be good enough as like an artist and have to put in the work to be able to get that. It's not just an overnight thing. It
isn't, but what we also have to deal with is the fact that none of this is merit driven.
Yeah.
Whether work is exhibited or not, or whether it sells or not, or whether you leave any lasting imprint with your work has nothing to do with how technically proficient you are as an artist. Maybe it should do, but it's not the way we work as people. We get excited by the hype of something. Quite often we raise things up that don't really have a great deal of value, and other things can be ignored that have value, or vice versa. It's unknowable, and it's all time dependent. The obvious ones, are the cliches of the artist is never successful until they're dead, kind of a notion.
Yeah.
Mercifully, that isn't necessarily true, but it can be.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And I think there's a conversation I was having earlier, actually, and I think that's the things. Like, there's a huge myth that people can create a living off the art really easily, really quickly, when actually that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it is, but not necessarily the case. And I think there's a huge myth that you look at an artist and you automatically assume because they're pumping out, say, a lot of work, that they're doing it full time, when actually they might not be. That might just be. I
think there's also a huge difference. Sorry to cut you off. There's a huge difference between the current history that we project and the actual reality of day-to-day making.
Yeah.
Just because, Instagram is a really fascinating one for this, because just because we're an artist is pumping out a great number of images. I've got this wonderful little cartoon that has two pictures. The first is Leonardo da Vinci holding up the Mona Lisa, saying, "I've taken 15 years or whatever it is to create this masterpiece, and I'm delighted." And the one below is somebody with their phone saying, "Oh my God, I haven't posted anything for 3 days on Instagram. People must think I'm a failure." Just because we don't have to give in to the mirage, to that's suddenly success. People can have beautiful looking shows where nothing sells, or are completely ignored, or I don't know. I guess I'm just a fan of work that's a bit, can be quiet or small, or isn't showy, or has to have kind of glaring neon around it to make it more important.
Your work is very pensive. That's how I describe it. I think that's really nice, because you're right. Like, it's not about, oh, look at this is so cool, look how great this is. It's, this is what I have to offer. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. I think that's what's really nice. And I think we definitely live in a society that is very hype driven, and that's very based on numbers and figures as opposed to actuality and talent. Because I think realistically, just because you have, and I say this every single time I do an interview, just because you have 1 million followers does not mean you have £1 million in the bank. And I think that's what people need to understand, is that hype is very different to selling. And I think when it comes to art, I think the idea of success is not determined by the amount of people who follow you, or the amount of likes a comment gets, or the amount of like value for art is within the engagement, and it's it's obviously within the monetary value, but it's within the engagement you create and the reciprocation you get from the people who view it.
Yeah,
at least I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that two things. We're all rather excited by the drama of ideas. That this person is showing in this place and they've got 50,000 followers or whatever it might be, and therefore they must be good. Or, this person hasn't got followers, didn't go to this school, didn't go there, doesn't have this CV, therefore they must be bad. And, the reverse can easily be true. But also, I'm not sure whether this is correct or not, but I suspect that there was a point in time when people went to museums and the first question in their mind wasn't, how much is this thing worth? When we made that compromise with commerce, that's the thing that became more important. And I guess, this is a completely separate issue, but there is a reason why the contemporary art market is the largest, apart from drugs, the largest unregulated market in the world. Where insider trading isn't just ignored, it's positively championed.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's but again, it comes down to the drama of it. We love the drama. We love the showmanship of it all.
I think also part of the problem is that a lot of artists have, well, art has a reputation of, oh, artists are flamboyant. They're kind of, the black sheep of the family. They're all kind of like, the odd ones out. And I think that's, not right now at this moment in time, that's just not how it is at all. But it's how it's still seen in many ways.
Well, it has to be.
Okay.
Because if we were projected as being ordinary, which we are, normal, ordinary people who have a particular take on things, then we'd have to accept that the work isn't perfect, and is the product of flawed people, and therefore probably wouldn't be quite as exciting and investment worthy in those terms. Again, it's wonderful smoke and mirrors. That we're convinced that when a painting is worth more than a house, I don't know. So
talking about the kind of the commerce of art, what do you think it means to be a successful artist, and how do you measure the success of your own work?
This is where I have to revert back to making some kind of romantic statement, which honestly isn't quite as romantic as it sounds. If I can truthfully make a good painting, a painting that I can stand behind and that can fit somewhere in art history, then that's the success. Everything else is for somebody else to decide. I don't get to decide whether I'm a success or not. I think a lot of it is primarily down to taste. Why, for example, was a painter like the obvious one is Bouguereau, that was at the height of French academic painting, incredibly famous in his time. And, within 150, 200, 150 years, people were defacing them in art schools, and people were actively being encouraged to draw on them, and they weren't worth anything suddenly. That's a reflection of fashion and taste changing. Modernism intervened. I think all I'm saying really is that we don't get to choose. We don't get to plot or strategize our way out of failure. So all we can really hope for is to hope to make a good painting.
Okay, that's a very, very, very good answer, I must say.
I told you it was romantic.
But it's very truth. It's like a very truthful answer, and I appreciate that. I think that's cool. I think it's very nice, because it shows me that you care about what you do, as opposed to just doing it for the sake of doing it. You're not just being like, I might as well just paint because I've got nothing better to do in my life. It's like, you actually feel what you're doing, and you actually engage with what you're doing. Honestly,
and this is probably the most revealing thing I can possibly say. I care about this. I deeply care about painting, what I'm doing, and its impact on me and what it might be capable of doing for others. And therein lies the responsibility again.
Yeah.
I have a responsibility to it. Not to confuse zeros on a bank balance with making a good picture.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And I think that comes across very well in the way you talk about your work and the way you talk about what it means to be an artist, which is why I like talking to people about their work, as opposed to just sending them emails with a list of questions, because sure, you get there's more engagement there. For me, it's a privilege for me to do it.
Well, I guess you carve away the levels of word weaving, because everybody's bio and statement is a boiled down, palatable version of the internal struggles of making.
So do you think that an artist can create too much work?
Yes, I do. And I think it comes back to a kind of pressure. We're pressured for inventory. And, it's why, and I mean no disrespect to artists that do this, because I understand the necessity of creating another income stream, but it's like the idea of prints. Yeah. Prints of paintings that are signed by the artist. It's an attempt to make more work quicker. and have more objects that can spread further.
Yeah.
I think that if the work is made very, very quickly, and no reflection is allowed, it becomes a stream of consciousness. And if one isn't careful, it ends up in a kind of Dada poem that becomes impossible to link. I think also, you have to have a way to edit. You have to be able to self-edit as you're going along. I mean, it may just be me saying that because I don't make a great deal of work. If I make 20 paintings a year, then that's a pretty damn good year. At times it's been 10 to 12, and I don't know. I guess there's no wrong way of doing things. It's just I am uncomfortable with the idea of a blizzard of objects. I think it's a rare person that can contain and sort of navigate that quantity. I mean, if you look at somebody like Anselm Kiefer, who I think was described as having an almost demonic creativity, who's is in the position where he's making masses and masses of work. He seems to be one of those rare people that can keep on top of the process of that that speed of generation. But personally, I struggle with the idea of making masses of work just for the sake of numbers.
So do you only sell original pieces then?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
The photography being an obvious exception that proves the rule.
Yeah.
I make works on paper that are effectively watercolors, but they're obviously uniques. All the paintings are unique, of course, by definition. I think the handmade is important to me.
That concludes the first part of this conversation with Mark Thompson. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or comments about the conversation, please send me an email via theflyingfruitbowl@gmail.com or via social media sites such as Instagram. The Flying Fruit Bowl audio interviews can now be found on a variety of sites such as Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the platform, please consider subscribing on any of those and sharing this interview with friends and family. Also, if you're a creative, please get in touch for a chance to be featured or interviewed. Once again, thank you very much for listening. And until next time, folks, please stay safe.